This footage is part of the Long Winter Archive, recovered after the collapse. For decades, we were told one story, that modern humans began in Africa. But what if that story is incomplete? New discoveries don't fit the timeline, fossils in the wrong places, dates that shouldn't exist. Tonight, we examine what history left out. Is the origin of humanity understood? Evidence challenges the African theory. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine yourself settling into the warmth of your bed, the weight of the day slowly lifting from your shoulders. Outside, the world sleeps beneath a blanket of stars, those same ancient lights that shone down upon our earliest ancestors as they gazed upward from African plains, Asian steppes, and European forests. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, we're going to explore one of humanity's most profound questions. Where did we truly come from? The answer, it turns out, is far more complex and fascinating than the tidy story many of us learned in school. So breathe deeply, relax, and let's journey together through time to examine the evidence that's challenging everything we thought we knew about human origins. The story we were told for decades, the narrative seemed clear, almost comforting in its simplicity. Humans evolved in Africa, specifically in the eastern regions of that vast continent, roughly 200,000 years ago. After developing there for millennia, our ancestors then embarked on a great journey around 50 to 70,000 years ago, spreading out across the globe in what scientists termed the out-of-Africa migration. As they traveled, these anatomically modern humans encountered and completely replaced older hominin species like Neanderthals in Europe and Homo erectus in Asia, without mixing, without interbreeding, leaving only one human species standing: us. This theory, formerly known as the recent African origin model or the out-of-Africa hypothesis, became the dominant framework for understanding human evolution in the late 20th century. It was elegant, supported by early genetic studies, and fit neatly with a growing body of fossil evidence. The model suggested a kind of evolutionary tree with a single trunk in East Africa that branched outward, with each branch representing modern human populations spreading to different continents. Scientists pointed to sites like Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, where fossils dating back approximately 195,000 years seem to mark the dawn of our species. The narrative had a poetic quality to it. We all came from one place. We were all connected by this single origin point, a cradle of humanity nestled in the Great Rift Valley. The genetic evidence seemed particularly compelling. In 1987, a groundbreaking study of mitochondrial DNA from 147 individuals around the world suggested that all human mitochondrial lineages traced back to a common ancestor in Africa somewhere between 140,000 and 290,000 years ago. This theoretical common ancestor became known popularly as mitochondrial Eve. Though it's crucial to understand, she wasn't the only woman alive at her time. Rather, she was the most recent woman from whom all living humans can trace an unbroken maternal line. This finding seemed to provide molecular support for the idea that modern humans arose in one location and then spread outward. Subsequent studies of Y chromosome DNA appeared to corroborate this picture, pointing to a Y chromosomal Adam who also lived in Africa, though at a different time than mitochondrial Eve. The pattern was clear. Follow the genetic breadcrumbs backward through time, and they all led to Africa. For many researchers, the case seemed closed. We knew where we came from. We understood our origins. The out-of-Africa model was promoted in textbooks, museums, and documentaries. It became part of our cultural understanding of who we are as a species. But science, at its best, never stops questioning. And as new technologies emerged, as dating methods improved, as more fossils were unearthed from caves and ancient lake beds across Africa, Asia, and Europe, the simple story began to crack. Not to shatter completely, the fundamental insight that Africa played a crucial role in human evolution remains solid, but to reveal a far more intricate, more fascinating reality than anyone had imagined. The Morocco discovery that rewrote the timeline on a promontory overlooking the plains of northwest Africa, between the ancient city of Marrakesh and the Atlantic Ocean, sits a cave system known as Jebel Irhoud. The site had been known since the 1960s, when miners blasting through rock accidentally exposed what would become one of the most significant paleoanthropological discoveries in history. When the first fossils were found at Jebel Irhoud in the early 60s, including a remarkably complete skull, researchers were puzzled. The remains didn't quite fit the established theories of human evolution. Initially, some thought they might represent African Neanderthals, or perhaps some archaic population that died out. Radiocarbon dating suggested they were about 40,000 years old, which made them a curious footnote, nothing more. For decades, the Jebel Irhoud fossils languished in relative obscurity, studied occasionally, but not integrated into the main narrative of human origins. That all changed in 2004, when French paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin decided to return to the site with modern excavation techniques and, crucially, with access to far more advanced dating methods. What his team would discover would fundamentally challenge our understanding of when and where Homo sapiens emerged. Beginning their renewed excavations, Hublin's team meticulously worked through the preserved layers of sediment in the cave. Their patience was rewarded beyond anything they'd hoped. They uncovered not just 1 or 2 fossils, but the remains of at least 5 individuals, 3 young adults, an adolescent, and a child estimated to be around 8 years old. Along with the bones, they found stone tools and evidence of fire, including burnt flints that would prove crucial for dating. The fossils themselves were remarkable in their preservation and completeness. There were partial skulls, lower jaws, teeth, and limb bones, all showing a fascinating mix of features. But it was the dating that would send shock waves through the scientific community. Using thermoluminescence dating on the heated flints, a technique that measures how long it's been since crystalline minerals in the stone were last exposed to heat, the researchers arrived at a stunning conclusion. These fossils weren't 40,000 years old. They were approximately 315,000 years old, give or take 34,000 years old. Additional dating using electron spin resonance on a tooth gave a similar age of 286,000 years. The numbers were confirmed through multiple independent laboratories to ensure they weren't the result of some error. Think about what this meant. In one excavation, the oldest securely dated Homo sapiens fossils had just been pushed back by more than 100,000 years. The significance cannot be overstated. If modern humans existed in Morocco 300,000 years ago, the entire timeline of human evolution needed revision. More than that, it meant the cradle of humanity wasn't a single location in East Africa. It was potentially the entire African continent. When you examine the Jebel Irhoud fossils closely, they reveal something even more fascinating than their age. The faces of these ancient people are remarkably modern. Their facial bones are short, flat, and tucked under the cranium in a way that falls comfortably within the variation of people living today. If you saw one of these individuals from the front, from the neck up, they wouldn't look particularly different from someone you might pass on the street. Their jaws and teeth, while larger than modern averages, align with early or recent modern humans rather than with other archaic species. This is the modern part of their anatomy. But turn one of these skulls to the side and you see something different. The brain case, the vault that houses the brain, is elongated, stretched out in a way that's more characteristic of archaic human species. It lacks the high, rounded shape that characterizes modern human skulls. This matters because brain case shape is associated with brain organization. The different shape suggests that while these people looked modern from the face, their brains may have been organized somewhat differently than ours. They had all the hardware, as it were, but perhaps the software wasn't quite the same yet. This mosaic pattern, modern features in some parts of the anatomy, archaic features in others, revealed that human evolution didn't happen all at once in a single population. Instead, different features evolved at different rates, a phenomenon scientists call mosaic evolution. The face became modern first, perhaps because facial structure is related to chewing and diet, which could have changed relatively early. The globular brain case, with its implications for how the brain is organized, came later, developing over hundreds of thousands of years. This suggests that becoming fully modern, achieving all the anatomical and presumably cognitive features we associate with Homo sapiens, was a gradual process spread across vast stretches of time. Jean-Jacques Hublin, standing among the ancient remains in the cave, told reporters that these fossils represented the very root of our species, the oldest Homo sapiens ever found in Africa or elsewhere. But he was careful to note that this didn't mean Morocco was the new cradle of humankind. Instead, the discovery pointed to something more complex, a Pan-African origin for our species. Humans didn't evolve in one Garden of Eden somewhere in the Rift Valley. They evolved across the breadth of Africa, with populations in different regions contributing to the gene pool that would eventually become modern humanity. The Jebel Irhoud discovery also illuminated other enigmatic fossils that had been found, but never quite fit into the existing framework. There's a partial cranium from Florisbad in South Africa, thought to be around 260,000 years old, that shows similar mosaic features. Suddenly, it made sense as representing the same kind of early Homo sapiens as seen at Jebel Irhoud. Together, these sites paint a picture of early Homo sapiens, not confined to one region, but spread across northern, southern, and eastern Africa, all roughly contemporary with each other. The implications ripple outward from this discovery like stones thrown into a still pond. If humans were widespread across Africa by 300,000 years ago, then our evolution must have involved populations living in very different environments, from Mediterranean Morocco to the savannas of East Africa to the southern tip of the continent. These groups would have faced different ecological pressures, developed different adaptations, and yet somehow remained connected enough through gene flow to evolve together as one species. The picture is one of a network rather than a simple tree, with multiple populations contributing their innovations, their adaptations, their genetic diversity to the emerging species. Moreover, the Jebel Irhoud fossils force us to reconsider what we mean by modern human. Are these people, with their modern faces and archaic brain cases, already Homo sapiens? Most researchers say yes, but it's a Homo sapiens in the process of becoming fully modern, a work in progress. This challenges the idea that there was some magic moment when modern humans suddenly appeared, fully formed. Instead, it was a process, a gradual transformation that played out across the African continent over hundreds of thousands of years, with different populations reaching modernity at different times for different features. Multiple waves, not one grand exodus. If the Jebel Irhoud discovery complicated our understanding of when and where humans originated, then the accumulating evidence for early movements out of Africa has thoroughly scrambled the simple narrative of a single unified exodus around 50 to 70,000 years ago. The reality, it turns out, is that humans have been leaving Africa and sometimes returning for far longer than anyone initially suspected. We were wanderers from the very beginning, probing outward, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, creating a complex pattern of dispersals that took hundreds of thousands of years to complete. Consider the evidence from the Levant, that critical land bridge between Africa and Eurasia. At a site called Mislia Cave in Israel, researchers discovered a fossilized upper jawbone, a maxilla, along with several teeth. This might not sound particularly exciting until you learn when this individual lived. Using multiple independent dating methods performed in separate laboratories around the world, scientists determined that the Mislia Cave remains are between 177,000 and 194,000 years old. This makes them the oldest known Homo sapiens fossils discovered outside of Africa, and by a significant margin. The implications are profound. If modern humans were in the Levant nearly 200,000 years ago, then the first movements out of Africa occurred much earlier than the traditional out-of-Africa model suggested. But here's where it gets interesting. These early migrants don't appear to be the ancestors of all non-African populations today. The genetic evidence suggests that most non-African humans today descend from a later wave of migration, the one that occurred around 50 to 70,000 years ago. So what happened to these earlier pioneers? Did they die out? Were they absorbed into later populations? The mystery deepens the more we learn. The Arabian Peninsula provides more pieces of this complex puzzle. In the United Arab Emirates, at a site called Jebel Faya, archaeologists discovered stone tools dated to approximately 127,000 years ago. The style of these tools resembles those found in East Africa from the same time period, suggesting that humans carrying African technology had reached Arabia far earlier than previously thought. In Oman, researchers found stone tools belonging to what's called the Nubian complex, a specific toolkit known from Sudan, dated to around 106,000 years ago. This provides evidence for a distinct Stone Age culture in southern Arabia, around the time of marine isotope stage 5, a period of relatively favorable climate when sea levels were lower and migration would have been easier. But perhaps most intriguing is the evidence from Asia itself. In southern China, at Jirendong Cave, researchers have found evidence of modern human presence dated to more than 100,000 years ago. Other evidence from various Chinese sites suggests human occupation 80,000 years ago or earlier. These dates predate the supposed main out-of-Africa migration by tens of thousands of years. How do we reconcile this with the genetic evidence that points to a more recent dispersal? The most likely explanation is that there were multiple waves of migration, some of which left genetic traces in modern populations, others which did not. A fascinating study from 2024 examining genetic evidence found that Southeast Asia served as a demographic center of expansion for early humans. According to this research, some out-of-Africa migrants actually returned to Africa, carrying with them genetic material from Eurasian populations. This back migration is evidenced by the presence of basal Y chromosome Eurasian lineages in the region. The picture this paints is not of a one-way journey from Africa to the rest of the world, but rather of a complex pattern of movement in multiple directions, with populations expanding outward, sometimes contracting back, intermixing, and diverging in waves. The southern route around the coast of Asia seems to have been particularly important. Evidence suggests that anatomically modern humans followed the coastlines of southern Asia beginning somewhere between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. And these coastal migrants reached Australia remarkably quickly, perhaps as early as 65,000 years ago, though some researchers place the arrival at 50,000 years ago. This rapid coastal dispersal makes sense from an ecological perspective. Coastlines provided rich resources, shellfish, fish, marine mammals, that could support human populations with relatively simple technology. Following the coast also meant you never had to venture far into unknown territory. You could always keep the ocean on one side as a navigational reference, but there's evidence for more northerly routes as well. Western Asia was occupied or reoccupied around 50,000 years ago. And from there, humans spread into Europe. Interestingly, genetic evidence suggests that the same population that gave rise to Europeans also contributed to the ancestry of people in India and beyond, indicating that these weren't entirely separate dispersals, but rather branching patterns from common source populations. The genetic signatures in modern populations show layer upon layer of these ancient movements, like geological strata recording the deep history of human wandering. What's becoming increasingly clear is that the traditional model of a single out-of-Africa event, around 50 to 70,000 years ago, represents an oversimplification. Yes, there was a major dispersal during that period, and yes, most non-African people today trace the majority of their ancestry to populations from that dispersal. But it wasn't the first time humans left Africa, and it wasn't even necessarily the most dramatic. Earlier attempts at leaving Africa occurred repeatedly throughout the late Middle Pleistocene, some leaving descendants that would later mix with the main wave of migrants, others apparently ending in local extinction or absorption. Think of it like this. Imagine Africa as a spring that periodically overflows. During favorable climate periods, when the Sahara was green and passable, when sea levels were low and land bridges accessible, populations would expand northward and eastward out of Africa. Sometimes these groups would establish successful, long-lasting populations in new territories. Other times, when climate deteriorated or resources became scarce, these outlying groups would contract, perhaps disappearing entirely, perhaps retreating back to refugia, where they could wait out hard times. Then, when conditions improved again, the process would repeat. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this pattern of expansion and contraction, dispersal and return would create an incredibly complex web of population movements. Modern genetic studies using sophisticated computational methods are beginning to map this complexity. Researchers can now model multiple waves of migration, estimate when different groups split from common ancestors, and even detect the genetic signatures of populations that no longer exist as distinct groups, but which contributed genes to later populations. What these models consistently show is that human population history is not a simple tree, but more like braided streams, separating, rejoining, separating again, with gene flow occurring between groups even after they had been separated for thousands of years. This new understanding fundamentally changes how we think about human diversity. The variation we see among human populations today isn't just the result of different groups adapting to local environments after spreading out from Africa in a single wave. It's the product of a much deeper, more complex history involving multiple dispersals, varying degrees of isolation, and gene flow, and perhaps most importantly, hundreds of thousands of years of evolution across diverse environments within Africa itself before any significant movement outward occurred. We are the heirs to all of that complexity, carrying in our genes the echoes of ancient journeys we're only now beginning to trace. The interbreeding revolution. Nothing is pure. Perhaps no set of discoveries has more profoundly transformed our understanding of human origins than the revelation that our ancestors didn't simply replace archaic human species, they interbred with them. For decades, the clean replacement model held sway. Modern humans emerged in Africa and then spread outward, encountering Neanderthals in Europe and Homo erectus in Asia, but remaining reproductively separate, ultimately driving these archaic species to extinction through competition for resources. This model fit with the prevailing understanding that species were discrete categories with reproductive barriers between them. We were Homo sapiens, they were other species, and never the twain shall meet, at least not successfully. Then came the Neanderthal genome. In 2010, an international team led by Swedish geneticist Svante Pääbo published a draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, painstakingly reconstructed from ancient bones found in Vindiga Cave in Croatia. When they compared this ancient DNA to the genomes of living humans from around the world, they found something unexpected. Non-African people, Europeans, Asians, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, all carried between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. Sub-Saharan Africans, by contrast, had little to none. The implications were clear. At some point after modern humans left Africa, but before they spread throughout Eurasia, our ancestors encountered Neanderthals and interbred with them. This was shocking to many researchers. Neanderthals had been considered a separate species, Homo neanderthalensis, sufficiently different from Homo sapiens that successful interbreeding seemed unlikely. The skull differences between the two groups are quite substantial, more distinct, in fact, than between most subspecies of other mammals. And yet, the DNA doesn't lie. Our ancestors and Neanderthals produced fertile offspring together, offspring whose descendants are us. Today, every non-African person reading this carries fragments of Neanderthal DNA in their genome, genetic echoes of encounters that took place perhaps 50 to 60,000 years ago in the Middle East or Europe. Just months after the Neanderthal genome was published, genetic analysis of a finger bone from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia revealed something even more astonishing. This bone, initially thought to be from a Neanderthal, turned out to belong to a previously unknown hominin group, now called the Denisovans, and modern humans had interbred with them too. The Denisovan genetic signature is particularly strong in Melanesian populations. People from Papua New Guinea and neighboring islands carry roughly 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA, significantly more than the Neanderthal percentage in Europeans. Lower levels of Denisovan ancestry, around 0.2%, are found in mainland Asian populations and Native Americans. But the interbreeding story doesn't end there. Recent research has revealed that the Denisovans themselves had a complex ancestry. They appear to have interbred with Neanderthals. In fact, about 17% of the Denisovan genome from Denisova Cave comes from local Neanderthal populations. Even more remarkably, genetic analysis suggests that Denisovans also received gene flow from a superarchaic population, hominins that had been separated from other human lineages for an extraordinarily long time. Perhaps since at least 2 million years ago. This superarchaic population, whatever it was, injected its genome into the Denisovan lineage around 350,000 years ago. So we have archaic humans interbreeding with other archaic humans who had interbred with even more ancient archaic humans. It's interbreeding all the way down, creating a web of genetic exchange that spans hundreds of thousands of years and multiple continents. There's even evidence for genetic exchange flowing in the other direction, from modern humans back into archaic populations. Studies have shown that Neanderthals received genetic material from modern humans, not just once, but potentially multiple times. Around 100,000 years ago, a population of modern humans that had left Africa encountered and interbred with Neanderthals, contributing to the Neanderthal gene pool. Later interactions between modern humans and Neanderthals continued to occur as modern humans expanded into Europe, creating a complex pattern of gene flow in both directions. One particularly remarkable fossil, known as Denisova 11, is a first-generation hybrid. She had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. The fact that such a hybrid individual exists in the fossil record suggests that interbreeding between these groups wasn't just occasional, but may have been relatively common when they encountered each other. The functional significance of this archaic DNA in modern human genomes is a subject of intense research. We're not just talking about neutral genetic variation that has no effect. Some of these archaic gene variants have been under positive selection in human populations, meaning they provided advantages that caused them to increase in frequency. For example, a variant of a gene called EPAS1, inherited from Denisovans, is common in Tibetan populations and helps them regulate blood oxygen levels at high altitude. Without this Denisovan genetic gift, permanent habitation of the Tibetan plateau might have been much more difficult for our ancestors. Similarly, variants affecting immune function have been inherited from both Neanderthals and Denisovans, and these archaic immune genes help protect modern humans from pathogens. In fact, at the HLA loci, genes crucial for immune function, the proportion of ancestry from archaic humans can exceed 50% in Europeans, 70% in Asians, and an astonishing 95% in Papua New Guineans. Interestingly, not all archaic DNA has been beneficial. Some Neanderthal genetic variants are associated with increased risk for certain diseases in modern populations, including diabetes, lupus, and Crohn's disease. Other Neanderthal genes affect physical traits, contributing to hair texture, skin color, and even the shape of our skulls. In the brain specifically, patterns are complex. Neanderthal ancestry in some regions affects sulcal depth and cortical complexity, potentially influencing aspects of how our brains are structured, though what this means for cognition remains unclear. Perhaps the most philosophically challenging aspect of these discoveries is what they mean for how we think about species boundaries and human identity. If modern humans could successfully interbreed with Neanderthals and Denisovans, producing fertile offspring that became our ancestors, then in what sense were these really separate species? The biological species concept, which defines species as groups that can potentially interbreed and produce fertile offspring, becomes muddy when applied to these ancient humans. We were different enough to be recognizably distinct populations, different enough to have evolved separately for hundreds of thousands of years, and yet similar enough that when we met, we could and did produce children together. This reality has led some researchers to argue that all of these groups, modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps others, should be considered as different populations within a single, widely distributed and variable species, Homo sapiens. Under this view, what we've been calling separate species were really more like subspecies, or distinct populations of the same species. Others maintain that the species designations remain useful, even if the boundaries were more permeable than previously thought. Regardless of the terminology we use, the genetic evidence makes one thing undeniable. The modern human gene pool is the product of contributions from multiple archaic human populations. We are, in a very real sense, a hybrid species. There's also evidence, though more controversial, that similar interbreeding may have occurred in Africa itself. Some studies suggest that certain West African populations carry genetic signatures that might come from admixture with an unknown archaic hominin population, one that split from the ancestors of modern humans and Neanderthals somewhere between 360,000 and over 1 million years ago. The percentage of ancestry from this mysterious population is estimated at anywhere from 2 to 19%, though these figures are uncertain and the interpretation is debated. If confirmed, this would mean that the interbreeding story isn't just about what happened when modern humans left Africa and encountered archaic populations in Eurasia. It would mean that archaic modern interbreeding was part of the story within Africa as well. Taking a step back to view the whole picture, what we see is a pattern of recurrent gene flow between different hominin populations over at least the last few 100,000 years. Modern humans didn't evolve in isolation and then burst forth to replace everyone else. Instead, we evolved in a context where multiple hominin groups existed across Africa and Eurasia, and when these groups encountered each other, they sometimes exchanged genes. This gene flow appears to have been bidirectional and happened on multiple occasions, creating what one research team described as a complex web of interbreeding among these lineages The human family tree isn't really a tree at all. It's more like a network with branches that split apart and then reconnect, a braided stream of genetic exchange spanning the old world. Researchers using sophisticated population genetic methods are now attempting to map out when these different interbreeding events occurred. Their findings suggest that Neanderthals and modern humans exchanged genes not just once, but potentially over a period spanning 200,000 years or more. Multiple pulses of admixture have been detected, suggesting repeated contact as populations expanded and contracted, met and separated across the changing landscapes of the Pleistocene. One recent study using machine learning to analyze genetic data concluded that the demographic picture is one of recurring dispersal from Africa, not a single unified migration event. Populations left Africa, interacted with groups already living in Eurasia, sometimes returned to Africa carrying Eurasian genetic material in a back-and-forth pattern that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. The revision is profound. Instead of thinking of modern humans as a pure lineage that arose in Africa and then conquered the world, we must recognize that we are the product of countless encounters between different human populations. Every non-African person alive today is a testament to successful interbreeding between modern humans and archaic populations. The traces of these ancient unions persist in our genomes, influencing our health, our appearance, and perhaps even subtle aspects of our cognition. We carry our complex history within us, written in the four-letter alphabet of DNA, regional continuity, and Asian evidence. While the genetic evidence for a primarily African origin of modern humans has become increasingly robust, there remain intriguing lines of evidence that suggest the story might be more complex than a simple radiation from a single source. These come primarily from morphological studies, examinations of the physical shapes of bones and teeth, and from the stubborn persistence of what's known as the multi-regional hypothesis, which, though no longer mainstream, has evolved in response to new discoveries and continues to highlight patterns that the simple out-of-Africa model struggles to explain. Perhaps one of the most powerful insights comes from looking at whole genome sequences rather than just specific markers. When researchers sequence complete genomes from diverse African populations and compare them statistically, they can model different scenarios and determine which best explains the observed patterns. These analyses consistently support what's been called a meta-population model, the idea that ancestral humans lived in multiple partially isolated subpopulations spread across Africa with periodic gene flow connecting them. The pattern is one of populations splitting apart during unfavorable periods when habitats contracted, then reconnecting when climate improved and habitats expanded, creating a dynamic equilibrium between isolation and mixing. This metapopulation structure has profound implications for how we interpret genetic diversity. When populations are structured, divided into subgroups that are sometimes connected and sometimes isolated, it can create patterns that look like very deep divergence times when analyzed with models that assume a single pan-mictic population. Some studies have suggested that human populations might have diverged 500,000 years ago or more, based on genetic data. But when you account for population structure, you can get similar patterns with much more recent common ancestry, because isolation within a structured population can preserve ancient variation that would be lost in a single large population experiencing constant mixing. One particularly revealing study, published in Cell in 2017, used ancient DNA from African individuals who lived thousands of years ago to reconstruct prehistoric population structure. The researchers found evidence for at least 4 major ancestral populations within Africa, with different modern African groups having varying amounts of ancestry from these ancestral populations. Importantly, these ancestral populations themselves had already diverged from each other well before the time period we traditionally think of as the origin of modern humans. The picture is one of ancient population structure. Groups that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years, coming back together to form the modern human gene pool. The archaeological evidence complements this genetic picture in interesting ways. Different regions of Africa show distinct cultural traditions during the Middle Stone Age, the period spanning roughly 300,000 to 30,000 years ago. In Northern Africa, you see one set of stone tool technologies and cultural innovations. In Southern Africa, completely different traditions emerge. Eastern and Western Africa each had their own characteristic assemblages. These regional differences in material culture suggest that populations were at least partially isolated from each other, developing their own technological solutions to local challenges. Yet there are also moments when innovations seem to spread rapidly across Africa, suggesting episodes of increased contact and gene flow. For instance, around 300,000 years ago, there's a continent-wide shift toward what archaeologists call Levallois technology, a sophisticated method of preparing stone cores to produce predictable flake tools. This technical innovation appears in multiple regions of Africa at roughly the same time, suggesting either rapid diffusion of ideas or independent invention in response to similar needs. Later, around 70,000 years ago, another technological shift occurs with the appearance of backed tools, beads, and other innovations associated with modern human behavior. Again, these innovations appear across much of Africa in a relatively short time window, suggesting that despite geographic barriers, populations remained connected enough to share cultural innovations. The environmental context for all this complexity is climate change. Africa's climate has oscillated dramatically over the past few 100,000 years, driven by changes in Earth's orbit and tilt that affect how much solar energy different parts of the planet receive. During favorable periods, the Sahara wasn't a desert, but a green savanna dotted with lakes and rivers, allowing human populations to spread across what is now inhospitable terrain. During unfavorable periods, the Sahara became the barrier we know today, isolating populations in northern Africa from those in sub-Saharan regions. Similarly, expansions and contractions of tropical forests, changes in rainfall patterns, and fluctuations in sea level all affected where humans could live and how different populations interacted. These climate-driven habitat changes created what ecologists call refugia, small pockets of favorable habitat where populations could persist during harsh periods. When climate improved, populations would expand out from these refugia, potentially encountering other groups that had survived in different refugia. Sometimes these encounters would lead to mixing, blending gene pools, and exchanging cultural innovations. Other times, competition for resources might lead to displacement or local extinctions. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this repeating pattern of contraction into refugia and expansion during favorable periods would create exactly the kind of complex population structure that we see in the genetic data. Modern genetic studies have even been able to identify some of these refugia. Statistical analyses of genetic diversity patterns suggest that during the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the last ice age around 20,000 years ago, African populations may have been largely restricted to a few favorable regions. The Horn of East Africa, a refugium in West Africa, and another in Southern Africa. As climate warmed and the Ice Age ended, populations expanded out from these refugia, mixing and blending to create the distribution of genetic variation we see today. And that's just from one relatively recent climate cycle. Similar patterns played out over and over during the deeper past, each cycle leaving its signature in the modern genetic landscape. What emerges from all this is a view of human evolution that's fundamentally different from the simple ladder model we started with. We didn't evolve in a single Garden of Eden and then spread outward in a wave of conquest. Instead, we evolved as a network of interconnected populations spread across the African continent, sometimes isolated from each other in refugia, sometimes expanding and mixing when climate allowed. Different populations contributed different innovations, anatomical, genetic, cultural, to the emerging species. The modern human genome is a mosaic, a patchwork quilt assembled from contributions by many different ancestral populations over hundreds of thousands of years. This also means that looking for the single origin point of Homo sapiens is, as paleoanthropologist Eleanor Seri has put it, a wild goose chase. There is no single location where modern humans originated, no Eden that we can point to and say, this is where it all began. Instead, people like us began to appear somewhere between 500,000 and 300,000 years ago across Africa, emerging gradually from a network of populations that were already widespread across the continent. The features we associate with modern humans, our distinctive skull shape, our cognitive abilities, our capacity for complex language and symbolic thought, emerged piecemeal, at different times and in different populations, gradually coalescing through gene flow and cultural exchange into the species we recognize as ourselves. The genetics tells us one more crucial thing. Despite all this complexity, despite the structured populations and the partial isolations and the different refugia, we are one species. The genetic differences between different African populations, while real and sometimes substantial, are dwarfed by the genetic similarities. All humans today share a common ancestry that traces back to these African populations. The tree hasn't shattered into separate species. The branches have remained connected through gene flow. We are united by our shared evolutionary history, even as we celebrate the diversity that history created, implications and the boundaries of knowledge. So where does all this leave us? After examining the fossil evidence from Morocco and South Africa, the genetic signatures of interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, the morphological puzzles from Asian sites, the shocking survival of small-brained hominins like Homo naledi, and the complex population structure revealed by modern genetics, what can we actually say we know about human origins? The scientific consensus, as it stands in 2025, goes something like this. Modern humans originated in Africa, but not in a single location or at a single moment. Instead, Homo sapiens emerged from a network of populations spread across the African continent, beginning somewhere around 300,000 years ago, or perhaps even earlier. These populations were partially isolated from each other by geographic barriers and climate fluctuations, allowing them to develop distinct characteristics, but remained connected enough through periodic gene flow to evolve together as one species. Different features we associate with modern humans: our facial structure, our globular skull shape, our cognitive abilities, evolved at different rates and appeared at different times in different populations, gradually spreading through the network via migration and interbreeding. Around 150,000 years ago, some populations began to develop the full suite of modern human characteristics, though significant variation persisted. Multiple attempts to leave Africa occurred over the next 100,000 years or more, with populations probing outward into the Levant and Arabia during favorable climate periods, sometimes establishing temporary footholds, sometimes retreating or dying out. The major dispersal that gave rise to most non-African populations today occurred roughly 50 to 70,000 years ago, though even this wasn't a single unified wave, but rather a complex series of movements. When modern humans encountered archaic human populations outside Africa, primarily Neanderthals and Denisovans, but possibly others, they interbred with them, incorporating genetic material that still persists in non-African populations today. This interbreeding was bidirectional and occurred multiple times, creating a web of gene flow connecting different hominin lineages. The result is that while modern humans are primarily descended from African populations, all non-African people carry small percentages of archaic human DNA that provides evidence of these ancient encounters. Within Africa itself, there's suggestive but not yet conclusive evidence for interbreeding with archaic populations as well, meaning the picture might be even more complex than currently understood. The evolution of Homo sapiens wasn't a simple story of one pure lineage arising and spreading. It was a messy, complicated process involving multiple populations, repeated episodes of mixing and separation, and contributions from diverse sources to the modern gene pool. That's what we know with reasonable confidence. But it's crucial to acknowledge the vast territories of uncertainty that remain. We don't know, for instance, exactly how many distinct populations were involved in the African metapopulation network. We have evidence for at least several, but there may have been many more that haven't left clear genetic signatures. We don't know precisely when the transition to fully modern anatomy and cognition occurred, or whether it happened once and spread, or occurred independently in multiple populations. The fossil record, rich as it has become, is still sparse, representing tiny snapshots scattered across enormous stretches of time and space. For every fossil we found, thousands or millions of individuals lived and died, leaving no trace. We don't fully understand the role of climate in driving population movements and gene flow. While we can see correlations between climate changes and apparent shifts in population dynamics, the causal mechanisms remain unclear. Did populations move in response to changing environments? Or did changing environments allow populations that were already moving for other reasons to succeed? How much of human prehistory was driven by environmental factors versus cultural innovations versus random demographic processes? The exact timing of many key events remains uncertain. Radiocarbon dating, our best tool for the last 40,000 years or so, doesn't work on older material. For older fossils, we rely on other methods: uranium series dating, electron spin resonance, luminescence dating, each with its own uncertainties and limitations. Ages given for ancient fossils often have error bars of tens of thousands of years, making it difficult to determine precise sequences of events or to know whether fossils from different sites are truly contemporary. New dating efforts using improved methods continue to revise our understanding, and it's entirely possible that ages currently accepted will change significantly with further research. The nature of archaic human populations and their interactions with modern humans remains a frontier of active research. We know Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred with modern humans, but we've only scratched the surface of understanding when, where, and how frequently these interactions occurred. There are hints in genetic data of other archaic populations, the superarchaic population, that may have interbred with Denisovans, the mysterious population that might have contributed DNA to some West Africans, possibly others in Asia that we haven't yet identified. Each new ancient DNA study seems to reveal more complexity rather than providing simple answers. Perhaps most fundamentally, we don't fully understand what makes humans unique. We can describe the anatomical differences between Homo sapiens and other hominins, the shape of our skulls, the proportions of our limbs, the structure of our teeth. We can sequence genomes and identify genetic differences. But translating these physical and genetic differences into understanding what made our cognitive abilities, our capacity for language, our propensity for culture different remains profoundly challenging. Were Neanderthals as cognitively sophisticated as we are? Could Homo naledi engage in symbolic thought despite their small brains? These questions touch on the hardest problems in neuroscience and philosophy of mind, and we're nowhere near definitive answers. The relationship between biological evolution and cultural evolution is another area where our understanding remains incomplete. During the period we're discussing, the last few 100,000 years, human culture clearly evolved in sophistication. Stone tools became more elaborate, Symbolic artifacts like beads and ochre decorations appeared, eventually giving rise to representational art, complex weapons, and all the other hallmarks of behavioral modernity. How much of this cultural evolution required biological changes in brain structure or organization? How much was simply cultural innovation, building on foundations that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years? The question matters because it affects how we think about the relationship between anatomy and behavior in fossil humans. If fully modern cognitive abilities required the fully modern globular skull shape, then archaic-looking skulls imply archaic cognition. But if the cognitive foundations for modern behavior were present much earlier, then anatomical modernity and behavioral modernity might not be tightly linked. These uncertainties don't mean we know nothing. The broad outlines of human origins in Africa, followed by dispersal and some interbreeding with archaic populations, are supported by multiple independent lines of evidence and are as well established as any scientific theory can be. But the details, the specifics of when, where, how, and why, remain active areas of research where new discoveries regularly force revisions to the prevailing models. This is how science works, building up understanding piece by piece, constantly testing and refining ideas, remaining open to new evidence even when it challenges cherished theories. Looking forward, several developments promise to illuminate dark corners of our evolutionary past. Ancient DNA technology continues to improve, allowing researchers to sequence ever older and more degraded samples. The record for oldest human DNA currently stands at around 400,000 years. Genetic material from Neanderthal ancestors found in Spain's Cima de los Huesos cave. If techniques continue to advance, we might eventually be able to sequence DNA from early Homo sapiens fossils, providing direct genetic evidence to complement the morphological and archaeological data. In Africa specifically, where heat and humidity degrade DNA faster than in cooler climates, improved preservation techniques and extraction methods might allow recovery of genetic material that would revolutionize our understanding of African population structure. Expanded exploration and excavation will undoubtedly yield new fossils. Much of Africa remains archaeologically unexplored, particularly regions like Central Africa and parts of West Africa, where thick vegetation and complex geology make fieldwork challenging. Every new cave system explored, every ancient lake bed excavated, has the potential to reveal fossils that could reshape our understanding. We've seen this happen repeatedly. The Jebel Irhoud discoveries, the Homo naledi finds, the Dragon Man fossils from China, each forcing us to update our models. Improved dating methods will help resolve chronological uncertainties. New techniques being developed, including improvements to existing methods and entirely novel approaches, promise more precise ages for fossils and archaeological sites. This matters because without good chronology, we can't determine sequences of events or test hypotheses about population movements and interactions. Better dates will mean better understanding of who lived when and where, and how different populations and species related to each other in time. Computational advances will allow more sophisticated modeling of population history. As computers become more powerful and statistical methods more refined, researchers can simulate increasingly complex scenarios and determine which ones best match the observed genetic, fossil, and archaeological data. Machine learning and artificial intelligence are beginning to be applied to these problems, potentially identifying patterns that human researchers might miss. These approaches won't replace traditional analysis, but they'll complement it, suggesting hypotheses that can then be tested with new data. Interdisciplinary collaboration will become increasingly important. The questions we're trying to answer about human origins can't be addressed by any single field working in isolation. Paleoanthropologists need to work with geneticists, who work with archaeologists, who work with climate scientists, who work with dating specialists, who work with computer modelers. This kind of truly integrated research is becoming more common, and it's the path forward for making progress on the hardest questions about our origins. The subdivided populations model, for instance, emerged from exactly this kind of collaboration, bringing together perspectives from multiple disciplines to create a framework that accommodates diverse types of evidence. The complex truth as we drift towards sleep, let's return to the question we started with. Is the origin of humanity understood? The honest answer is both yes and no. We understand the broad outlines far better than we did even a decade ago. The evidence strongly supports an African origin for modern humans, but an African origin that's more complex and nuanced than the simple story told in many textbooks. We know that multiple populations across Africa contributed to the modern human gene pool, that different features evolved at different rates, that the process took hundreds of thousands of years. We know that when modern humans encountered other human species outside Africa, they interbred with them, creating the genetic diversity we carry today. But the details remain frustratingly elusive. We can't yet point to a specific location and say, this is where Homo sapiens first appeared. We don't know exactly when the transition to behavioral modernity occurred or what cognitive changes underlay that transition. We don't know how many times humans left Africa before the successful dispersal that gave rise to most non-African populations. We don't know the full extent of interbreeding between different human lineages, either outside Africa or within it. We don't know what happened to many of the populations whose genetic signatures we detect. Did they die out? Were they absorbed? Did they disappear for other reasons? What's remarkable is that each new discovery, rather than simplifying the picture, tends to make it more complex. The 300,000-year-old fossils from Morocco pushed back the origin of Homo sapiens by 100,000 years and revealed that our species was spread across Africa from its earliest days. The discovery of Denisovan DNA in modern humans revealed an entirely unsuspected population of archaic humans who interbred with our ancestors. The survival of Homo naledi until 200,000 years ago demonstrated that Africa hosted multiple human species simultaneously. The detection of structured populations in genetic data showed that modern humans emerged from a network rather than a single source population. Each answer raises new questions. This increasing complexity isn't a failure of science. It's a feature of reality. The history of life is messy and complicated, full of contingencies and chance events, with populations splitting and merging and going extinct in patterns that don't fit into neat categories. The simple stories we like to tell about a single origin point, a linear progression from primitive to advanced, clean boundaries between species, are simplifications that break down when confronted with the richness of actual evidence. The truth is more interesting than fiction, but it's also harder to summarize in a single neat narrative. What we can say with confidence is that the traditional out-of-Africa model, while not wrong in its essentials, is no longer adequate. Yes, modern humans originated in Africa. Yes, they then dispersed to other continents. But the origin wasn't a point event. It was a process spread across time and space. The dispersal wasn't a single wave. It was multiple movements over hundreds of thousands of years. The replacement of archaic populations wasn't complete. Interbreeding occurred, leaving genetic traces. Africa itself wasn't a simple backdrop. It was a dynamic landscape of structured populations connected by shifting patterns of gene flow. The African theory, the fundamental insight that our species arose in Africa, stands stronger than ever. What's being challenged and refined isn't the African origin per se, but our understanding of what that origin meant. It wasn't that modern humans suddenly appeared fully formed in one small region and then spread out. It was that populations across Africa, connected by gene flow but partially isolated by geography and climate, evolved together over hundreds of thousands of years, each contributing to the emergence of modern human anatomy and behavior. The cradle of humanity wasn't a single location. It was an entire continent. This new understanding should make us humble. For decades, the simple out-of-Africa model seemed so clear, so well supported, that it became accepted as settled science. And in broad strokes, it was correct. African origins are real, but the devil is in the details, and the details have turned out to be far more complex than anyone imagined. Every generation of scientists thinks they've finally figured out the big picture, and every generation is eventually surprised by discoveries that force revision of the models. There's no reason to think our current understanding is final or complete. Future discoveries will undoubtedly reveal complexities we haven't yet imagined, forcing further refinements to our models. What's exciting is that we're living through a golden age of discovery in human origins research. New techniques are being developed, new fossils are being found, new analytical methods are being applied. The pace of discovery is accelerating, not slowing. The next decade will likely bring revelations as transformative as the Neanderthal genome, the Jebel Irhoud fossils, or the Homo naledi discovery. We can't predict what those discoveries will be, but we can be confident they'll force us to rethink aspects of human evolution we thought we understood. For now, as you settle into sleep, perhaps there's comfort in the complexity. We are the product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution across an entire continent, of populations meeting and mixing and diverging, of innovations emerging and spreading, of countless individuals whose names we'll never know, but whose genetic legacy we carry. We are hybrids in the best sense, blending contributions from diverse African populations and, for those with non-African ancestry, from Neanderthals and Denisovans as well. Our diversity is not a recent superficial variation. It has deep roots stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. The story of human origins isn't one of purity and isolation, but of mixing and connection. It's a story that reflects the complexity and contingency of biological reality, where neat categories blur, where the tree of life has braided branches, where species are not fixed entities but dynamic populations constantly exchanging genes and evolving together. It's a story that reminds us that we are one species despite our diversity, united by recent common ancestry, even as we celebrate the rich variation that evolutionary history has created. As the evidence continues to accumulate, as new discoveries illuminate dark corners of our past, the story will keep evolving, but the fundamental insight remains. We are Africans, all of us, descended from populations that lived and evolved on that continent for hundreds of thousands of years before spreading around the globe. The African origins of humanity are not in doubt. What's changing is our appreciation for how complex and fascinating those origins really were. If you've enjoyed exploring the mysteries of human evolution, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the Long Winter Archive. We'll continue to bring you the latest discoveries and ideas about our deep past, told with the depth and nuance these extraordinary subjects deserve. Until next time, sleep well and dream of the ancient past that made us who we are today. Confined to that region, or is it simply that we haven't yet found its remains elsewhere? Given how fragmentary the hominin fossil record is, especially from forested or tropical environments where bone preservation is poor, it's entirely possible that Homo naledi, or related species, had a much wider distribution than the current fossil evidence suggests. Every few years, new species of ancient hominins are discovered, from Homo luzonensis in the Philippines to Homo longi, the dragon man fossils, in China, each adding to the picture of diversity. What Homo naledi definitively demonstrates is that the period during which Homo sapiens evolved was not a time when our ancestors had the continent to themselves. The narrative of human evolution can't be simplified to primitive species evolved into modern humans in a linear sequence. Instead, We were part of a diverse community of different hominin species, each with its own adaptations, its own evolutionary history, and its own place in the African ecosystems of the Middle Pleistocene. We happen to be the lineage that survived and eventually spread around the world. But we weren't alone, and we weren't inevitable. Our existence today is the result of a particular path through a landscape of possibilities where other paths were being explored simultaneously. The humility this should inspire is profound. For most of the 20th century, paleoanthropology organized human evolution into a neat ladder. Australopithecus gave rise to Homo habilis, which gave rise to Homo erectus, which gave rise to archaic Homo sapiens, which gave rise to modern Homo sapiens. Each rung was more advanced than the last. This latter model has been thoroughly dismantled by discoveries of the past few decades. We now know that multiple hominin species often coexisted, that the path to modern humans wasn't a straight line but a branching bush, and that what we consider advanced features, like large brains, didn't evolve in a simple progressive manner, but appeared and disappeared multiple times in different lineages. Homo naledi, with its small brain and late survival, is perhaps the clearest example of how wrong the latter model was. This wasn't a primitive precursor to humans living millions of years ago. This was a distinct species with its own suite of adaptations, successful enough in its own right to persist for perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, living alongside our ancestors. Understanding our origins requires grappling with this complexity, accepting that the human story is messier, more contingent, and more diverse than the tidy narratives we might prefer. In a very real sense, the Homo naledi discovery forces us to rethink what it means to be human. If small-brained hominins could engage in complex behaviors like possibly deliberate burial and creating art, then brain size alone doesn't define humanity. If we shared the continent with other human species for hundreds of thousands of years, then our uniqueness is more recent and more fragile than we might have imagined. What modern genetics really reveals, the revolution in ancient DNA technology has transformed our understanding of human origins, but even more powerful in some ways has been the analysis of DNA from living people. By comparing genetic sequences from thousands of individuals representing populations from around the world, researchers can reconstruct the history of how different groups are related when they diverged from common ancestors, and how genes have flowed between populations. What this work reveals is a picture of human origins even more complex than the fossil record alone could ever show. One of the most important findings is that modern genetic diversity is structured in a way that doesn't support a single origin point for Homo sapiens, even within Africa. When researchers analyze genetic variation across African populations, they find that different groups diverged from each other very deeply in time, often 300,000 years ago or more. The deepest split in the human family tree, the oldest divergence between groups who are still living today, separates some southern African populations, particularly certain groups like the San and other Khoisan peoples, from other African populations. This divergence appears to have occurred somewhere between 200,000 and 350,000 years ago, depending on which study you look at and which methods are used. This is significant because it means that populations we'd all recognize as Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, were already substantially differentiated from each other at a time roughly contemporary with the Jebel Irhoud fossils. They weren't living in a single population in one location. They were spread across the continent in groups that were distinguishable from each other genetically. The implication is that what we call the origin of Homo sapiens wasn't a point event that happened in one place at one time. It was a process that played out across Africa over tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, with different populations contributing different pieces of the modern human genetic puzzle. Researchers have used various statistical methods to model these ancient population splits and mergings. One influential model, proposed by a team led by Eleanor Seri and published in the journal Trends in Ecology and Evolution, describes what they call African multi-regionalism, or the subdivided populations model. According to this framework, the populations ancestral to all living humans were structured into multiple subpopulations within Africa, living in different regions and partially isolated from each other by geographic barriers or simply by distance. These populations would have experienced different selective pressures and evolved somewhat independently, developing different regional adaptations. However, they weren't completely isolated. Gene flow occurred between them, sometimes frequently, sometimes rarely, depending on climate cycles and other factors. During favorable climate periods when the Sahara was green and passable, when lakes and rivers provided corridors for movement, these populations would have been more connected, with increased gene flow homogenizing variation and allowing beneficial adaptations from one region to spread to others. During unfavorable periods when deserts expanded and forests contracted, populations would have become more isolated in refugia, scattered pockets of habitable territory, allowing them to diverge. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this pattern of connection and isolation, gene flow and divergence would create the complex genetic structure we see today. One vivid metaphor that's been used to describe this process is intertwining stems rather than branches of a tree. Instead of a tree where lineages split and never reconnect, imagine multiple stems that grow separately for a while, then twist together, then separate again, creating a plaited or braided pattern. Gene flow, the movement of genetic material from one population to another through migration and interbreeding, connects the stems. This is fundamentally different from both the simple out-of-Africa model, which imagines a single stem giving rise to all the branches, and the multi-regional hypothesis, which imagines many separate stems evolving in parallel. The intertwining stems model acknowledges both the ultimate African origin and the complex population structure within Africa. Another way to think about it is in terms of the geographic scale of the processes involved. When we talk about human origins in Africa, we need to remember that Africa is enormous, more than 11.5 million square miles, larger than China, the United States, and India combined. The distance from Morocco to South Africa is roughly equivalent to the distance from London to Beijing. Modern humans evolving in Africa doesn't mean they evolved in one valley or even one region. It means they evolved across a continent, with populations in different areas contributing to the overall gene pool in different ways and at different times. Genetic studies have also revealed something fascinating about population sizes. The genetic diversity in modern humans suggests that during our evolutionary history, our effective population size, the number of individuals who are actually contributing genes to future generations, went through significant fluctuations and at some points was quite small. Some models suggest there may have been bottlenecks, periods when the total effective population size of our ancestors dropped to perhaps 10,000 individuals or less. These bottlenecks could represent times when climate deteriorated and human populations contracted into scattered refugia, barely hanging on. One particularly interesting finding comes from studies of recombination patterns in modern human genomes. Recombination is the shuffling of genetic material that occurs when DNA from the mother and father combines to form offspring. By looking at patterns of recombination in different populations, researchers can infer something about the history of population structure. What they've found is evidence for something they call deep structure, the signature of populations that were separated from each other for very long periods before eventually mixing. This deep structure is consistent with the subdivided populations model, supporting the idea that Ancestral human populations within Africa were structured into groups that had limited gene flow between them for extended periods. Studies of the X chromosome and autosomes, the non-sex chromosomes, have also provided insight into population history. Because the X chromosome has a different inheritance pattern than autosomes, females have 2 copies while males have only 1. It experiences different evolutionary dynamics. Comparing patterns of variation on the X chromosome versus autosomes can reveal information about sex-biased migration, whether males or females moved between groups more frequently, effective population sizes, and the history of population structure. These studies generally support a complex model with structured populations bottlenecks and recurring gene flow. Interest in challenges comes from dental morphology, the study of tooth shapes. A comprehensive analysis of over 5,000 teeth from Homo and Australopithecus specimens published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that teeth from African and Eurasian samples showed distinct morphological patterns. Eurasian teeth, particularly those at the front of the mouth, displayed what researchers called morphological robusticity, including triangular, shovel-shaped forms that differed systematically from African specimens. The researchers argued that if all Eurasians descended from a recent African population, we would expect to see more similarity in tooth morphology. Instead, the patterns suggested to them that regional populations in Eurasia might have deeper roots, with some continuity from earlier hominin populations. This type of evidence supports what's known as regional continuity, the observation that in certain areas, particularly in Asia and Australia, there seem to be morphological similarities between ancient local hominins and modern local populations. In China, for example, some researchers have noted that fossils attributed to Homo erectus from sites like Zhoukudian, the famous Peking Man site, show certain features that are also found in modern East Asian populations. Similarly, in Indonesia and Australia, some claim to see continuities from ancient Homo erectus specimens to modern indigenous populations. This is the core of the multi-regional hypothesis, first formally proposed by Milford Wolpoff and colleagues in the 1980s. The hypothesis suggests that modern humans evolved not from a single population in Africa, but from multiple archaic populations across Africa, Asia, and Europe, all evolving in parallel, but connected by gene flow. Under this model, Homo erectus populations spread out from Africa around 2 million years ago and then evolved in place, with enough gene flow between regional populations to keep them all evolving together as one species. Modern Chinese would thus trace much of their ancestry to ancient Homo erectus populations in China. Modern Europeans would have substantial ancestry from Neanderthals, and so on. It's crucial to understand that the original multi-regional hypothesis explicitly included gene flow between populations as a key component. This is often misunderstood. Critics sometimes portray the model as proposing completely independent evolution in different regions, which would be impossible for populations to remain a single species. But Wolpoff and his colleagues always emphasized that regular genetic exchange between populations was essential to their model. They weren't suggesting that Chinese populations and European populations evolved into modern humans completely separately. That would indeed be implausible. Instead, they proposed a network model where populations in different regions contributed unequally to the modern gene pool while remaining connected enough to evolve as a single species. For many years, multi-regional versus out of Africa was framed as a binary choice. Either modern humans arose in one place and replaced everyone else, or they arose in multiple places through parallel evolution. The genetic evidence, particularly the mitochondrial DNA studies of the 1980s and 90s, seemed to decisively favor the out-of-Africa model. But, as we've seen with the interbreeding discoveries, The real story is more nuanced. Modern humans did indeed have a recent origin in Africa. The genetic evidence for this is overwhelming. However, they also interbred with archaic populations when they encountered them outside Africa, meaning there was some regional genetic continuity after all, just not as much as the strong multi-regional model proposed. This has led to what some researchers call assimilation models, or African hybridization and replacement models, intermediate positions that acknowledge a primarily African origin while allowing for varying degrees of interbreeding with local archaic populations. The question becomes not whether there was any regional continuity, but how much and how it varied across different regions. The genetic evidence suggests that the overwhelming majority of modern human ancestry, perhaps 95% or more, traces back to African populations within the last few 100,000 years. But that remaining 5%, the archaic component, represents regional continuity of a sort. Interestingly, a Chinese researcher named Wang Shi has recently proposed what he calls an out-of-East Asia model, explicitly challenging the African origin hypothesis. His argument, based on patterns of genetic diversity, suggests that East Asian populations might have lower genetic diversity than expected if they descended from African populations through multiple bottlenecks during migration. He interprets this pattern as suggesting that East Asia, not Africa, was the origin point for modern humans. However, it's important to note that this interpretation goes against the overwhelming consensus of genetic evidence, which consistently shows the highest levels of genetic diversity in African populations. Exactly what we would expect if Africa were the ancestral home. Lower diversity in populations outside Africa can be readily explained by founder effects and bottlenecks during the out-of-Africa dispersal. Nevertheless, Huang's work represents a continuing debate and shows that questions about human origins remain active areas of research. The cradle of humanity wasn't a single place. It was an entire continent.